Jordan Wells lowered her gaze to the check in her hand as if inspecting a stain. It was a check for $78,000, a number so large and so critical that it almost carried a physical weight. She stood in the gleaming marble hall of Vanguard Trust Gold Coast branch. It was a space that radiated old money, crystal chandeliers, a near icy silence, and the October sunlight outside reflecting proudly off the glass walls. When her number was called, Jordan stepped up to the teller window. She was wearing a worn Stanford University hoodie, a garment she wore with pride but which felt acutely out of place here. She faced a teller in her late 40s, blonde hair pulled back tight, reading glasses perched on her nose. Her name tag read, Brenda. "Good morning," Jordan said politely, her voice practiced to sound clearer and steadier than she felt. "I'd like to deposit this check, please." Brenda took the check without looking up. Then her eyes landed on the amount. Her gaze traveled slowly from the check to Jordan's face, down to her worn hoodie, then back to the check. $78,000, she said, voice pitched loud enough that nearby customers glanced over. "That's quite a substantial amount." Jordan kept her voice level. "Yes, ma'am. It's for my Stanford tuition and housing deposit. My mother wrote the check." "Stanford." Brenda's eyebrows rose in a way that was anything but congratulatory. "And you're sure this check is legitimate?" At the next window, an elderly white man was depositing a similarly large check with swift efficiency. No questions, no loud announcements, just smooth, respectful service. Jordan noticed. She always noticed. "Yes, ma'am. It's for my mother's account, Simone Wells." Brenda frowned at the signature, then at Jordan again. "I'm going to need to call the manager." "Please step aside." Jordan moved to the side, standing in that terrible space between being helped and being dismissed. She stood there, weighted down by the curious, judgmental glances. She watched other customers come and go, their transactions completed while she waited. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "How did it go, baby? All clear?" Jordan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she pocketed the phone. She didn't want to worry Simone. "Not yet." A man emerged from the back office. Tall, early 50s, graying hair, an expensive, perfectly tailored navy suit. His stride was purposeful, almost aggressive, and when his eyes landed on Jordan, they were already cold with judgment. Robert Sterling had been branch manager of Vanguard Trust for 12 years. He had cultivated an environment where certain people were welcomed and certain people were questioned, where certain names opened doors and certain faces closed them. He approached holding the check, like evidence. "You're the one trying to deposit this?" "Not hello, not how can I help you. Just accusation wrapped in a question." "Yes, sir," Jordan said, chin lifted slightly. "That's my Stanford tuition deposit. My mother wrote that check." Robert examined the check with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it over, holding it to the light, running his thumb across the signature. "Your mother? And what does your mother do?" "She's a CEO." Jordan kept her answer short. "A CEO?" His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of what company?" "InnovateX Global." He didn't recognize the name, or didn't show it. "And where do you live?" The question had nothing to do with the check. They both knew it. "Why does that matter?" Jordan asked quietly. "I'm trying to verify the legitimacy of this check, young lady." "Where do you live?" Around them, the bank continued its rhythm. Customers came and went. Jordan stood in the center, feeling every eye that turned her way. "The South Side," she finally answered. Robert's eyebrows rose. "The South Side? And you expect me to believe your mother just wrote you a check for $78,000 for Stanford?" "It's not about what you believe," Jordan said, an edge creeping into her voice. "It's about what's true. You can call her to verify." "Oh, I intend to verify, but first I need additional identification. Driver's license, passport, school ID." Jordan handed over her license. Robert studied it with exaggerated care, then handed it back. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into his office with her check. Minutes passed. Jordan remained standing near the teller windows, her backpack growing heavier on her shoulders. Other customers glanced at her as they passed, some with curiosity, others with a pity that made her feel more exposed. Through the glass walls of Robert's office, she could see him on the phone, gesturing while holding her check. He wasn't calling her mother. The way he kept glancing out at her with suspicion, this wasn't verification. This was something else. Finally, Robert emerged and approached with deliberate slowness. "I've been on the phone with our fraud prevention department," he announced loud enough that customers turned to look. "They have concerns about this check." Jordan felt heat rise in her chest. "What concerns?" "The amount is unusually large for someone your age. The signature doesn't match our records exactly, and frankly, we see a lot of attempted fraud. You'd be surprised how creative people get." "I'm not trying to defraud anyone," Jordan said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "That check is legitimate." "If you'd just call my mother—" "I don't need to call anyone," Robert interrupted. "What I need is for you to explain where you really got this check." The implication hung in the air like poison. Around them, the bank continued its normal rhythm. An older white woman at the counter was depositing an even larger check, and the teller was smiling at her, asking about her grandchildren. No interrogation, no accusations, just smooth, respectful service. Jordan pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my mother right now." "Put the phone away," Robert said sharply. "You're disrupting other customers. I'm disrupting?" Jordan looked at the people now openly staring. "You're the one making a scene." "All I did was try to deposit a check. Do you have other documentation?" "Bank statements from your mother's account, tax returns, proof of enrollment at Stanford?" The questions came rapid fire, each designed to undermine, to suggest guilt. Jordan thought about the white students at her prep school who talked casually about their parents writing checks for boats and vacation homes. She tried to imagine any of them being interrogated like this. She couldn't, because it would never happen to them. "I have my acceptance letter from Stanford," Jordan said quietly, "but I shouldn't have to prove this. This is my mother's check from her account made out to me. You're treating me like I stole it. I'm treating you like someone who walked into my bank with a very large check and a story that doesn't add up," Robert said. "If you can't provide additional documentation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave while we complete our investigation." "Investigation of what? Of me trying to deposit money that belongs to my family?" She saw it then in Robert's eyes. Something ugly and old. A prejudice so deeply rooted he probably didn't recognize it as prejudice anymore. To him, this was just procedure, just being thorough, just protecting the bank from people like her. Jordan showed him the Stanford acceptance letter on her phone. Robert barely glanced at it. This could be fabricated. People Photoshop these things all the time. Something in Jordan's chest went cold and hard. She opened her text thread with her mother. "Mom," she typed, "they won't accept the check. The manager says it might be fraudulent. He won't even call you to verify." The response came within seconds. "What's his name?" "Robert Sterling, branch manager." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Okay, baby. Don't worry. I'm handling this. Just stay calm and don't let them make you feel small." Jordan looked up at Robert, who was still holding her check with that expression of smug certainty. "My mother is handling this," she said quietly. Robert's smile was condescending. "I'm sure she is. In the meantime, I need you to wait outside while we complete our investigation." "I'm not going anywhere," Jordan said. "Not until you process my check or give me a legitimate reason why you can't." The standoff lasted another 10 minutes. Jordan refused to leave. Robert refused to process the check. Other customers began to notice the tension, the way the young black girl stood her ground while the white manager loomed over her. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched with open curiosity. Robert finally stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone somehow more threatening for its quietness. "Listen carefully. I have been more than patient, but this check is not getting processed today. Not without proper verification, which will take at least 72 hours. So you can either leave voluntarily, or I will have security escort you out." "I'm not leaving without my check," Jordan said steadily. "Your check." Robert's voice rose, the mask of professional courtesy slipping. "This isn't your check. This is a piece of paper you brought into my bank with a wild story about Stanford and a CEO mother." He turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers as if appealing for validation. "We have procedures in place for a reason. To protect honest, hardworking customers from people who think they can walk in here and what?" Jordan interrupted, her voice cutting through his performance. "Say it. People like me who think we can what?" Robert's face flushed. "People who think they can commit fraud." "That's not what you were going to say." Jordan's eyes were steady on his face. And in that moment, she looked older than 18. Looked like her mother facing down a boardroom of men who had underestimated her. "You were going to say something else." Something about people like me. The bank had gone quiet. Even the tellers had stopped working to watch. Robert seemed to realize he had an audience, and something ugly crystallized in his expression. He had gone too far to back down. "You know what?" Robert said, holding up the check. "I've had enough of this." And then, before Jordan could react, before anyone could stop him, he tore the check in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the silence like a gunshot. He tore it again and again until Jordan's $78,000 Stanford tuition deposit was nothing but confetti in his hands. "Get out of my bank," Robert said, his voice thick with contempt. "You come in here with your fake checks and your attitude, thinking you're going to pull something over on us. Well, not here, not in my branch. Girls like you need to learn that there are consequences for trying to game the system." He let the pieces flutter down onto the counter between them. "Stanford, you should focus on finishing high school before you start dreaming about Ivy League schools. Now get out before I call the police and have you arrested for attempted fraud." The words hit Jordan like physical blows. Around them, the silence was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The customers stood frozen, some with shock, others with voyeuristic fascination, watching this young woman being publicly humiliated. Jordan looked down at the shredded pieces of her mother's check scattered across the counter. Her hands were shaking, her whole body trembling with rage and humiliation so profound she could barely breathe. But she would not cry. She would not give Robert Sterling that satisfaction. She began picking up the pieces one by one, her movement slow and deliberate. Each fragment went into her pocket, evidence of what had been done to her. Her throat was tight, her eyes burning, but she kept her face composed. "I will remember this," Jordan said quietly, her voice steady despite everything. "Every word you said, everything you did." Robert waved his hand dismissively. "Remember whatever you want. Just get out before I have you removed by force." Jordan straightened, meeting his eyes one last time. In that moment, Robert Sterling saw something in her expression that should have warned him. Something that said she was not defeated, not broken, but he was too pleased with himself to recognize what he was looking at. Jordan turned and walked toward the exit, every eye following her. The automatic doors slid open and she stepped out into the Chicago morning. Behind her, she heard the bank resume its normal sounds. The mundane business of money moving through systems built to exclude people like her. Her hands were still shaking as she pulled out her phone and called her mother. When Simone answered, Jordan's voice finally cracked. "Mom," he tore up the check in front of everyone. "He called me a scammer and said I should focus on finishing high school instead of dreaming about Stanford. He said girls like me are trying to game the system." There was a long silence. When Simone spoke, her voice was quiet and controlled, but Jordan could hear the steel underneath. "Tell me everything, baby." Every single word he said, every person who was there. Standing on the sidewalk with pieces of her destroyed check in her pocket, Jordan recounted every moment of her humiliation. And as she spoke, she didn't know that her mother was already making calls, already setting in motion a response that would shake the foundation of that bank. What Robert Sterling had failed to understand was that he hadn't just torn up a check. He had torn up the dignity of a young woman whose mother had spent 30 years building an empire specifically so her daughter would never have to experience what Simone herself had endured. "Listen to me." "Jordan," Simone said firmly, "you did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. What happened is not about you. It's about a system that's been broken for a long time, and people like Robert Sterling who think they can keep it broken, but they don't know who they're dealing with." Jordan wiped her eyes. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done a long time ago. I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Those procedures they claim to follow, the ones that somehow only apply to certain people, we're about to find out if they really believe in them." Simone Wells hung up the phone with her daughter and sat in silence for exactly 30 seconds. Then she made her first call. The bank had gone quiet. Even the tellers had stopped working to watch. Robert seemed to realize he had an audience, and something ugly crystallized in his expression. He had gone too far to back down. He was no longer a professional manager. He was an entitled gatekeeper making a final stand against an intrusion he felt personally threatened by. "You know what?" Robert said, holding up the check with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. His voice was loud, echoing slightly off the marble and glass. "I've had enough of this. You come in here, disrupting business, wasting the time of honest customers with your unbelievable story and your attitude. He paused, scanning the faces of the onlookers, mostly older, white and wealthy, who nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming his righteousness. This was his stage, and he was performing the role of the vigilant protector. And then, before Jordan could react, before anyone could stop him, he tore the check in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the silence like a gunshot. It wasn't a tentative tear. It was a violent, angry, decisive act. He tore it again and again, his hands working quickly, fueled by his self-assured contempt, until Jordan's $78,000 Stanford tuition deposit was nothing but confetti in his hands. "Get out of my bank," Robert said, his voice thick with unmasked fury. "You come in here with your fake checks and your wild stories, thinking you're going to pull something over on us. Well, not here. Not in my branch." He let the pieces flutter down onto the counter between them, a shower of financial destruction. They settled softly, landing among the sleek brochures for wealth management services. "Girls like you need to learn that there are consequences for trying to game the system." He spat out. "Stanford, you should focus on finishing high school before you start dreaming about Ivy League schools. Now get out before I call the police and have you arrested for attempted fraud." The words hit Jordan like physical blows. He had moved past questioning the check. He was questioning her right to aspire, her right to occupy the same economic space as his clientele. Around them, the silence was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The customers stood frozen, some with genuine shock, others with a chilling, detached voyeurism, watching the young woman being publicly humiliated. Jordan looked down at the shredded pieces of her mother's check scattered across the counter. Her hands were shaking, her whole body trembling with a mixture of rage and profound humiliation so intense she could barely breathe. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to cry, to lash out. But a deeper, colder resolve took over. She would not cry. She would not give Robert Sterling that satisfaction. She began picking up the pieces one by one, her movement slow and deliberate, a precise, methodical ritual of resistance. She didn't rush. She meticulously collected every fragment, the way her mother had taught her to always collect the facts. Each tiny piece of paper, the corner with the bank routing number, the center with the dollar amount, the edge with the signature of Simone Wells, was evidence. She deposited each fragment into the small zipper pocket of her backpack. Her throat was tight, her eyes burning, but she kept her face composed. She straightened up slowly, meeting Robert's gaze. "I will remember this," Jordan said quietly, her voice steady despite the seismic trembling underneath. "Every word you said, everything you did." Robert waved his hand dismissively. "Remember whatever you want. Just get out before I have you removed by force. We've already wasted enough time." Jordan straightened, meeting his eyes one last time. In that moment, Robert Sterling saw something in her expression that should have warned him. Not the defeat he expected, but a chilling, quiet certainty. It was the look of someone who had just decided the terms of a war. But he was too pleased with himself, too secure in his privilege, to recognize the existential threat he was facing. Jordan turned and walked toward the exit, every eye following her. She didn't look back. The automatic doors slid open and she stepped out into the crisp Chicago morning. Behind her, she heard the bank resume its normal sounds, the clink of coins, the low hum of conversation. The mundane business of money moving through systems built to exclude people like her was already back on track. Her hands were still shaking as she pulled out her phone and called her mother. When Simone answered, Jordan's voice finally cracked. "Mom, he tore up the check in front of everyone. He called me a scammer and said I should focus on finishing high school instead of dreaming about Stanford. He said girls like me are trying to game the system." There was a long silence. When Simone spoke, her voice was quiet and tightly controlled. But Jordan could hear the steel underneath, the sound of a CEO transitioning into a strategist. "Tell me everything, baby." Every single word he said. Every person who was there. "Do you still have the pieces of the check?" "Yes, Mom, in my pocket." "Good, you did nothing wrong." What happened is about a system that's been broken for a long time, and people like Robert Sterling who think they can keep it broken. They don't know who they're dealing with. Standing on the sidewalk with pieces of her destroyed check in her pocket, Jordan recounted every moment of her humiliation. What Robert Sterling had failed to understand was that he hadn't just torn up a check. He had torn up the dignity of a young woman whose mother had spent 30 years building an empire specifically so her daughter would never have to experience what Simone herself had Endured. Simone Wells hung up the phone with her daughter and sat in silence for exactly 30 seconds. Then she made her first call. Jordan stood outside the Vanguard Trust branch, the Gold Coast sunlight suddenly feeling cold and harsh. The automatic doors had hissed shut behind her, sealing her humiliation inside the polished marble tomb. Her whole body was still trembling, but the rage was hardening into something cold and sharp. She reached into her pocket, the brittle scraps of the $78,000 check confirming the reality of what had just happened. She pulled out her phone and called her mother, Simone Wells. The CEO of InnovateX Global was in a high-stakes virtual meeting with a board member in San Francisco, discussing a potential 9-figure acquisition. She was seated in her sleek downtown Chicago office, a space of exposed concrete, minimalist art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that perfectly encapsulated her own trajectory from the south side to the pinnacle of tech power. Simone saw Jordan's name flash on the screen. She immediately signaled to her chief financial officer, CFO, to take the lead. "Excuse me one moment," she said, her voice betraying none of her immediate concern. She stepped away from the conference table, answering the call privately. "Jordan, what is it, baby? You sound frantic." Jordan's carefully maintained composure shattered. "Mom, he tore it up. The manager, Robert Sterling, he tore up the check. In front of everyone." Her voice was a choked sob, ragged with shame and fury. Simone's own breath hitched, but she pressed on, her CEO training taking over to extract critical data. "Slow down. Tell me everything. Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm outside the bank." He ripped it up into pieces. He said it was a fake check and I was trying to game the system. He looked right at me and said, "Girls like you need to learn there are consequences." He threatened to call the police. Jordan recounted the entire brutal exchange, the words pouring out in a torrent of pain and indignation. "I collected the pieces. I have them." Simone listened in absolute, controlled silence. She didn't offer a platitude or an immediate comfort. Instead, she asked only factual, tactical questions. "What is the branch manager's name again?" "Robert Sterling." "Branch manager. Did he make any specific comments about your neighborhood, the South Side, or your school?" "Yes. He asked where I lived, scoffed when I said the South Side, and said I should focus on finishing high school instead of dreaming about Ivy League schools." "Were there witnesses? Other customers or employees?" "Dozens." The tellers stopped working. Simone took a deep, steadying breath. "Listen to me, Jordan. You did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. What happened is not about you. It's about a broken system and a small, petty man who thinks he's a gatekeeper. He just made the biggest mistake of his life. What are you going to do?" Jordan whispered. "What I should have done a long time ago. I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Now, I need you to go home. Go to the gym in the basement, put on your headphones, and stay off social media. Your job is to be an 18-year-old and get ready for Stanford." "My job starts now." Simone hung up the phone. She stood still for exactly 30 seconds, allowing the decades of suppressed rage from her own past experiences with corporate prejudice to fuel her resolve. She looked out over the glittering cityscape, her empire spread out beneath her, and reached a decision. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a scorched earth campaign for dignity. She strode back to the conference table, reclaiming her position. Her tone was now calm, but carried an edge of absolute steel that brooks no argument. "This meeting is adjourned. Mr. Davies, please take over the acquisition negotiations. Clear my schedule for the rest of the week. Everything." Her assistant, Marcus, a sharp young man who knew better than to ask questions when Simone used that tone, moved to her side instantly. "Yes, Ms. Wells. First, call the managing partner at Chappell & Stone, my outside counsel. Tell her I need a team assembled in my boardroom within the hour. Corporate law, civil rights, and financial discrimination specialists. They need to be prepared to file a federal suit against a major banking institution." "Understood." "Against Vanguard Trust. They will be named as defendants." "Second, get me every piece of documentation we have on Vanguard Trust Bank. Shareholding percentage, board members, all public communications, and SEC filings from the past 5 years. I want it on my desk, digitized and printed in an hour, immediately. Third, call Keisha Davis, our VP of Communications. She is to start quietly compiling complaints regarding discriminatory practices at Vanguard Trust's Chicago branches. Social media, consumer databases, everything. Keep it confidential. She is not to issue any statement or contact any media until I give the explicit order." Simone gathered her briefcase and a notepad. Mr. Sterling just tore up a check from the largest single shareholder of his institution in front of a dozen witnesses, while making racially charged remarks. He didn't just commit a banking offense, he committed a catastrophic fiduciary and public relations blunder. We're going to dismantle him and his entire system, brick by brick. No drama, just methodical, overwhelming power. "Let's go to war, Marcus." Simone walked toward the door, not glancing back at the abandoned acquisition meeting. She was already in the war room in her head, preparing to leverage her two most powerful assets, data and capital. Robert Sterling had thought he was protecting the bank from a threat. He was about to learn he had just declared war on the bank's true power structure. Within 90 minutes of Jordan's frantic call, Simone Wells' sprawling penthouse office was transformed into a command center. Her elite legal team from Chappell and Stone, led by Martha Chappell, a formidable corporate litigator, occupied one side of the massive conference table. Their expensive suits a contrast to the piles of printed documents already accumulating. Simone didn't storm the bank demanding justice. That wasn't how she operated. Real power wasn't about dramatic emotional gestures. It was about preparation, strategy, and knowing exactly where to apply pressure for maximum effect. "I want absolute silence from InnovateX Global," Simone instructed her communications VP, Keisha. "No leaks, no comments. We are not a victim seeking sympathy. We are an institution demanding accountability. This will be played out on their terms first. We wait for their move." Keisha nodded, already coordinating discreet social media monitoring. "Understood, Simone. We're tracking the digital chatter, but we haven't linked Jordan's name or the bank yet. It's a low burn for now." Simone focused on the legal and financial data spread before her. "Martha, what do we have on Vanguard Trust's structure?" Martha, without opening a file, recited the core information. "Vanguard is publicly traded but majority controlled by institutional investors. There's a tightly knit board. They pride themselves on tradition and stability. They hate scandal. And the shareholders?" Simone pressed. Martha paused, looking at a printout on the table. "This is where it gets interesting, Simone. Since you acquired the late Mr. Harrington's portfolio last year, your private trust, the Bennett Wells Foundation, holds precisely 37% of Vanguard Trust's non-institutional common shares. You are the largest single non-institutional shareholder of the entire bank." A slow, cool smile touched Simone's lips. Robert Sterling didn't just tear up a customer's check. He tore up a check signed by the owner of more than a third of the company he managed. The leverage was absolute. "Good. We will use that leverage, but we won't reveal it yet." Next item, Robert Sterling's personnel file. Marcus, her assistant, delivered a surprisingly thin file. It was difficult to obtain internal data discreetly, but we pulled his publicly available professional history and cross-referenced it with internal whispers. Sterling has been branch manager for 12 years. His file is conspicuously clean, marked exemplary service and high performance. But what? Simone asked, leaning forward. "We have an unconfirmed pattern," Marcus continued, pointing to a section labeled Customer Complaints, Unsubstantiated. Over the past 3 years, there are 12 documented complaints from customers, all people of color, regarding excessive scrutiny, service denial, or questioning of funds. Every single one was dismissed internally by Regional Manager Marcus Webb as a misunderstanding or procedural adherence. It was all swept under the rug. Simone tapped the file. "Sterling and Webb, they are cut from the same cloth. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern of institutionalized exclusion, a culture that Robert Sterling cultivated and Marcus Webb protected. The goal is not just Sterling's job," Simone stated, looking around the table at her powerful team. "The goal is to dismantle that pattern. We won't be filing a lawsuit immediately. We will force the bank to investigate themselves publicly, and when they inevitably try to minimize the situation, we will release the video and the documentation of the other 12 victims. This is a corporate raid for justice." She spent the late afternoon in methodical, ice-cold preparation. She drafted a concise professional email to Robert Sterling, addressed simply from S. Wells, priority customer, requesting a formal explanation for the unusual handling of her daughter's transaction. She didn't mention InnovateX or her shareholding. She wanted to see how he'd respond when he thought she was just another parent with a complaint. Robert Sterling went home that evening feeling entirely satisfied. He told his wife about the aggressive girl who tried to deposit a fake check, how he'd handled it decisively, how you had to be firm with people trying to take advantage. He slept well that night, secure in his righteousness, completely oblivious to the fact that across the city, Simone Wells was building a case that would dismantle everything he had ever built. She was not just a disgruntled parent, she was the silent owner of his fate. Robert Sterling arrived at the Vanguard Trust Gold Coast branch the next morning, feeling emboldened. He was still radiating the smug satisfaction of the previous day, having firmly defended his branch's standards against what he perceived as an attempted shakedown. As he sipped his coffee, he opened his internal email. The complaint from S. Wells' priority customer, which he had dismissed the previous night, was waiting for him. Email 1, incoming complaint, sent 8:15 p.m. Subject, formal request for review of unusual handling. Transaction, 88302 SWF from swells@trustoprivateaccount.com. To Robert Sterling, branch manager. Dear Mr. Sterling, I am writing to request a formal review and explanation regarding the highly unusual and unprofessional handling of my daughter, Jordan Wells, during a deposit transaction yesterday afternoon. The check in question was a legitimate bank check from my account, intended for her college tuition deposit. Your staff's conduct, specifically the public questioning of her legitimacy, the refusal to verify the funds with me, and the subsequent destruction of the instrument, is unacceptable and concerning. I expect a detailed, written explanation outlining the specific, standard verification procedures that justified this action. Sincerely, S. Wells Priority. Customer Robert Sterling read the email twice, a condescending smirk spreading across his face. The mother is trying to make a federal case out of this, he thought, just as I predicted. She used the priority customer tag, classic intimidation from people who think they can throw money around to get their way. He quickly drafted his response, ensuring it was curt, procedural, and utterly dismissive. He was careful to use the language of policy and diligence, cloaking his prejudice in corporate politeness. Email 2. Sterling's response, sent 8:45 a.m. Subject, formal request for review of unusual handling. Transaction, 89302 SWF from Robert Sterling, Sterling of VanguardTrust.com. 2. S. Wells, trustoprivateaccount.com. Dear Ms. Wells, your daughter's recent transaction was processed, entirely in accordance with standard Vanguard Trust verification procedures and fraud prevention protocols. Due to the unusually large amount and the inability of the customer to provide adequate secondary documentation at the time of deposit, the decision was made to halt the transaction for a 72-hour investigation, which is standard policy. Our protocols are in place to protect all our honest, hardworking customers from financial risk. No further action is required from this branch. Regards, Robert Sterling, Branch Manager. Vanguard Trust, Gold Coast. Satisfied, Robert leaned back. It was a perfect shutdown. No apology, no admission of error, just a stiff defense of protocol. It was a clear message to the mother that her complaint was a waste of his time, but he wasn't finished. He wanted validation. He needed to share the triumph with someone who understood how the world worked. He forwarded the entire thread to his regional operations manager, Marcus Webb, a man cut from the same exclusionary cloth who had always protected Sterling's status quo. Email 3, internal forward, sent 8:46 a.m. Subject, FW, formal request for review of unusual handling, transaction. 89302 SWF from Robert Sterling, Sterling VanguardTrust.com. 2. Marcus Webb, Regional Manager Mwebby VanguardTrust.com. Robert Sterling's typed note. Look at this, Marcus. The mother is trying to make a federal case. They never learn. Some people think they can just intimidate us with a complaint letter. I shut it down fast. Have my back if she pushes. Time to teach these people a lesson about wasting our time. Within minutes, Marcus replied, his tone mirroring Sterling's condescension. Email 4, Marcus Webb's reply. Sent 8:51 a.m. Subject, FW formal. Request for review of unusual handling, transaction. 89302 SWF from Marcus Webb, Regional Manager Mwebba VanguardTrust.com. 2. Robert Sterling Roosterling of VanguardTrust.com. Will do, Robert. Perfect response. We did everything by the book. 30 years in this business, you learn to spot the scammers. Pattern recognition. These people think we're stupid. Keep me posted, but this should die here. Robert read the exchange, a feeling of security washing over him. The system worked. He had his boss's approval, and the complaint was handled. He genuinely believed he had won. Neither of them realized that these emails, their smug certainty, their coded language of exclusion, these people, and their agreement to obstruct justice had just become irrefutable evidence in the case Simone Wells was meticulously building against them. Simone, working from her war room, received Robert's curt response within the hour. She printed it, her expression never changing. She saved it, adding it to her growing file of evidence. It was everything she needed: a refusal to apologize, an explicit defense of protocol, and a clear dismissal of a legitimate customer's concern. The stage was set for her next move. The moment for playing by the bank's rules was over. Sarah Jenkins, a young teller at the Vanguard Trust Gold Coast branch who had witnessed the entire incident, couldn't sleep. She was in her mid-20s, struggling to manage student loan debt and expensive Chicago rent. She had seen Jordan Wells. She had seen the look in Robert Sterling's eyes when he tore that check. She had heard the dismissive remarks about girls like you. Sarah had worked at this branch for 2 years, and she had seen the pattern repeat itself. Customers of color questioned excessively. Procedures applied selectively. She had always looked the other way, staying silent out of fear of losing her job. She needed this employment. But the sight of Jordan gathering those shredded pieces, the terrible dignity in the eye of the storm of humiliation, haunted Sarah. This time, silence was no longer neutrality. It was complicity. That morning, Sarah arrived at the bank with a shaking resolve. She needed proof. She knew the system. As a longtime employee, she had clearance to access the branch's security camera system. While Robert Sterling and Marcus Webb spent the better part of the morning discussing how to shut down Simone Wells's complaint, Sarah acted. She utilized a quiet moment, accessing the security server in the back office. She found the footage from Brenda's station yesterday. The entire incident, from Sterling's aggressive approach, the contrast with the smooth transactions of white customers, to the dramatic check-tearing moment and his final words, was clearly recorded, her hands trembling. She quickly made a digital copy of the footage, transferring it onto a small flash drive, which she concealed in her purse. She felt a surge of adrenaline, the guilt of violating company rules mixing with a thrilling sense of freedom. She knew she had just risked everything. That evening, back at her apartment, Sarah spent hours searching online. She found Jordan Wells's post on Twitter. Jordan had shared the story without naming the bank or the manager, but her words resonated. Tried to deposit my Stanford tuition check today. Manager tore it up and called me a scammer. I'm 18. I'm tired of having to prove I deserve to exist in spaces built for everyone else. The post had gone viral overnight. Thousands of comments, shares, people adding their own stories of discrimination everywhere. Justice for Jordan was already trending across Twitter and TikTok. The anger was building like a wave. Sarah made her decision. She created an anonymous burner email account and sent a direct message to Jordan. I work at the bank where this happened. I witnessed the whole thing. I have the security video. I think people should see what really went down. His actions were deliberate. Jordan showed Simone the message. Simone understood the immense risk this woman was taking. She immediately had her lawyer discreetly verify Sarah's identity and reached out carefully. If you share that video, there will be repercussions, Simone messaged. But I can protect you legally and, if necessary, offer you a position at InnovateX Global. I want you to know what you're walking into. Sarah's response was simple and powerful. I've been watching this happen for 2 years. Different customers, same pattern. I'm tired of being complicit by staying silent. I want it out. Sarah had prioritized her conscience over job security. She sent the video to a reputable journalist known for investigating discriminatory practices at Chicago banks. Robert Sterling's incident was about to move from an internal complaint to a national scandal, captured on irrefutable video evidence. Jordan's initial social media post, a quiet expression of frustration that was already gathering thousands of shares, suddenly became a flashpoint. The post, which hadn't named the bank, had simply read, "Tried to deposit my Stanford tuition check today. Manager tore it up and called me a scammer. I'm 18. I'm tired of having to prove I deserve to exist in spaces built for everyone else. You're banking while black, the footage leak. The true catalyst arrived when the journalist who received the footage from Sarah posted a meticulously edited, time-stamped clip accompanied by a detailed article investigating systemic bias at Chicago's high-end banks. The security footage was damning. It showed everything. Robert Sterling's dismissive treatment of Jordan from the start. The way he questioned her repeatedly while nearby white customers were processed smoothly the moment he tore the check, the pieces fluttering down, and his exact, contemptible words. Girls like you need to learn there are consequences. Most powerfully, it showed Jordan's quiet dignity as she picked up each scrap of paper with trembling hands before walking out. The explosion within an hour of the video going live, it had millions of views. Within a day, it was national news, social media. The video exploded across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Justice for Jordan was the #1 trending topic worldwide. People shared their own stories of being questioned, denied, or treated with suspicion when handling large sums of money. The thread became a collective catalog of financial microaggressions. Media frenzy. CNN, MSNBC, and local Chicago stations immediately picked up the story. News vans, complete with satellite dishes, were parked down the street from the Vanguard Trust Gold Coast branch, reporters fighting for space on the sidewalk. Organizational outcry. Civil rights organizations issued furious statements. The NAACP called for a formal investigation into the bank's lending and customer service practices. The ACLU demanded Robert Sterling's immediate termination and comprehensive anti-discrimination training across the entire institution. The public anger wasn't just about a single bad manager. It was about the visible confirmation of a long-suspected truth, that systemic exclusion was still alive, dressed in a Navy suit and operating behind the marble counters of elite institutions. The video provided irrefutable proof that procedures were weaponized against specific people. Sterling's isolation. Robert Sterling's phone started ringing before dawn, vibrating so intensely it fell off his nightstand. First was Patricia Lowe, his regional director, whose voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "What the hell did you do, Robert?" "I have reporters calling, board members asking questions. Legal is losing their minds." "Tell me that video is fake." "Patricia, listen, I don't want to hear it, not yet. I'm coming down there tomorrow and you better have a damn good explanation." She hung up before he could respond. Sterling tried calling Marcus Webb, his partner in dismissing the initial email. Marcus didn't answer. He tried again. The call went straight to voicemail. Suddenly, the entire wall of institutional defense that Sterling had relied upon for decades collapsed. Everyone was too busy, too occupied, or too terrified to take his call. The walls were closing in, and his carefully cultivated righteousness was dissolving under the brutal glare of national scrutiny. By evening, Vanguard Trust corporate headquarters was in full crisis mode. The CEO was being frantically briefed. Legal was preparing defensive statements. PR was fielding hundreds of calls, desperately trying to put distance between the bank's values and Sterling's actions. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. The anonymous witness, Sarah, watched the news reports from her couch, the fear of losing her job offset by a deep, profound sense of vindication. She had risked her career, but she had forced an institution to look at its own face. And that face was ugly. The viral video sent shockwaves through the executive suite of Vanguard Trust's corporate headquarters in New York. The crisis team, a swarm of stressed executives, PR specialists, and corporate lawyers, convened in a sterile, glass-walled conference room. Their initial strategy of issuing a generic, deeply regrets the incident statement was shredded when the NAACP and ACLU publicly declared their intent to investigate the bank's broader pattern of discriminatory practices. The focus instantly shifted from managing a PR problem to battling an institutional catastrophe. "We have to terminate Sterling immediately," declared Richard Chen, the chief legal officer, his voice tight. "We hang him out to dry and call him a rogue agent. It's the only way to mitigate the liability." "But the internal emails," shouted the head of HR. "We just found the thread between Sterling and Webb. They explicitly discussed shutting down the mother's complaint and used coded language. That proves systemic protection." The CEO, Howard Reed, a man used to handling market volatility, not moral outrage, slammed his hand on the table. "Find the mother. Offer her anything, a full refund, a $500,000 settlement, a scholarship fund named after her daughter. We need silence before the market opens tomorrow. The call to the chairman, while the crisis team scrambled, Jonathan Price, the chairman of the board, a figure of old-school financial gravity, was informed of the full scope of the disaster. He was handed a discreet internal report detailing the shareholding structure. His jaw tightened when he saw the name Simone Wells listed under the Bennett Wells Foundation. "Is this accurate?" Price asked his personal counsel, pointing to the line item, 37% non-institutional common shares. "Yes, Mr. Price. When she acquired the late Harrington's portfolio last year, she became the single largest non-institutional shareholder, more than any investment fund. She owns a controlling minority stake, sir." Price understood instantly. This wasn't a customer seeking compensation. This was a powerful owner seeking governance. The stakes had just soared past PR and liability into the realm of fiduciary duty and corporate control. Robert Sterling hadn't just insulted a young black woman. He had provoked the bank's silent majority owner. Price picked up his phone and called the direct, unlisted number provided for Simone Wells. The confrontation Simone answered on the second ring. She was calm, sitting in her war room, reviewing the documented complaints from the other 12 victims, the ammunition she had gathered. "Ms. Bennett, this is Jonathan Price, chairman of the Vanguard Trust board," Price began, his voice strained but authoritative. "I understand your daughter was the young woman in that appalling video. On behalf of the entire organization, I want to offer our deepest, most profound apology. We are taking immediate action." "I appreciate the call, Mr. Price," Simone replied coolly. Her voice was steady, utterly devoid of emotion. "And I assume you're aware of the identity of the person you're speaking to?" A palpable pause hung in the air across state lines. Price swallowed hard. Yes, we have that information. We are aware of your substantial position in the company." "Good. Then you'll understand when I say I'm not interested in a private apology or a quiet settlement," Simone stated, her voice hardening with purpose. "What happened to my daughter happens to people every day in your branches. I have documentation of 12 similar cases in Chicago alone over 3 years, all dismissed by your regional manager. This isn't about one rogue manager. This is institutional failure. As a major shareholder, Mr. Price, I intend to ensure this institution either fixes itself or faces the consequences." The chairman had expected a lawsuit, perhaps bad press. He hadn't expected Simone Bennett, armed with data, strategy, and the overwhelming leverage of 37% ownership. "We will convene an emergency board meeting tonight," Price finally said, defeat already creeping into his tone. "I'd like you to attend." "As a major shareholder, you have every right." "I'll be there," Simone confirmed, "with my legal team. Be prepared to discuss immediate leadership changes and a comprehensive mandatory overhaul of your entire anti-discrimination policy." Simone hung up. She had just gone from filing a customer complaint to demanding control of the bank's governance. The crisis was no longer Vanguard's to manage. It was Simone's to direct. The emergency board meeting was convened remotely at 10 p.m. EST. Simone Wells sat in her office war room, flanked by Martha Chappelle and her corporate legal team. On the giant screen, the faces of the Vanguard Trust board of directors, a collection of mostly older, strained white men and women, stared back from their various homes and offices. Jonathan Price, the chairman, looked utterly exhausted. Price began with a tightly rehearsed statement. "Ms. Bennett, we have already taken steps. Robert Sterling is on immediate administrative leave. We are finalizing his termination and are prepared to offer Miss Wells a full scholarship, endowment, and a confidential 7-figure settlement to address the emotional distress and reputational damage." He was offering the standard corporate solution. "Money for silence. Thank you, Mr. Price." "But I am not here as a parent seeking compensation," Simone countered, her voice calm and amplified by the conference system, commanding immediate attention. "I am here as a shareholder with a fiduciary responsibility to this institution. And frankly, your institution is currently failing its legal, ethical, and financial duties." She paused, allowing the weight of her next words to settle. "Before we discuss settlements, let's talk about governance. As the largest non-institutional shareholder, my interest is in the long-term stability and integrity of Vanguard Trust. And right now, your integrity is a liability. The evidence of systemic failure, Martha Chappelle and the legal team distributed digital documents to the board members simultaneously. The files were titled Pattern of Exclusion, Vanguard Trust, Chicago Region. Mr. Sterling is not a rogue actor, Simone continued, her tone accusatory but grounded in fact. He is the product of a negligent culture. Over the past week, my team compiled evidence of 12 separate, documented incidents across your Chicago branches over the last 3 years. Simone clicked a slide, displaying the anonymized but damning summary. 12 customers, all people of color, all subjected to excessive, humiliating scrutiny, denial of service, or questioning of legitimate funds. A black business owner questioned extensively about his payroll deposit. A Latino family denied a loan despite meeting all criteria. An Asian American woman asked repeatedly to prove identity for a simple withdrawal. And every single one of these complaints, Simone leaned into the camera, her gaze piercing, was internally dismissed by your regional manager, Marcus Webb, as procedural adherence or misunderstanding. These internal emails, which we have secured, show a systemic effort to protect discriminatory behavior, not customers. The screen was filled with stunned silence. The board had been prepared to sacrifice Sterling. They were not prepared to have their own internal cover-up exposed by their largest owner. The demands. Therefore, Simone concluded, I am not interested in a quiet settlement. I am interested in change. I am presenting the board with an ultimatum. She laid out her immediate, non-negotiable demands: immediate termination of Robert Sterling for cause, with a public statement citing discriminatory practices; immediate termination of Marcus Webb for actively enabling and covering up a pattern of discrimination; mandatory anti-discrimination overhaul, instituting a $5 million annual fund for mandatory, independently conducted bias training for all 15,000 employees, overseen by an external civil rights organization; independent audit, establishing an independent oversight committee with guaranteed minority representation to audit all loan applications and major transaction denials over the last 5 years. No confidentiality. Vanguard Trust must issue a transparent, public apology to Jordan Wells and all other affected customers, detailing the systemic failure. You have 2 options. Mr. Price, Simone finished, her voice steel cold. You accept these terms and begin fixing your institution, which will mitigate your public relations disaster and satisfy your largest shareholder. Or I will release this video, the 12 documented cases, and the internal emails publicly at a press conference tomorrow, and simultaneously initiate a shareholder action suit citing failure of fiduciary duty due to demonstrable negligence and systemic discriminatory risk. Jonathan Price looked down at the documents, his face ashen. He knew the financial and reputational cost of a shareholder action suit led by Simone Wells would be catastrophic. It would make their stock plummet and invite federal regulators to investigate their entire operation. Ms. Bennett, Price said, his voice barely a whisper, we will have to confer internally for an hour. But I believe we understand your position. Simone simply nodded. I will be waiting. The true power play was complete. She had seized control of the narrative and the boardroom. 1 week after the video went viral, Vanguard Trust Bank announced an emergency press conference at their downtown Chicago headquarters. By 1:30 p.m., the conference room was packed. Journalists, television cameras from every major network, civil rights activists, and community leaders filled every seat and standing room space. In the front row, quiet but resolute, sat Jordan Wells, her hands folded in her lap. The bank had required both Robert Sterling and Patricia Lowe, the regional director, to attend. Sterling sat at a table on the stage, his face pale and clammy. His expensive suit looked less crisp than usual. Patricia gripped her chair's arms with white-knuckled tension. Marcus Webb, the regional manager who had signed off on the cover-up emails, had conveniently called in sick. The room buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew this was more than a standard corporate apology. The video had been too damning, the outcry too loud, and the presence of civil rights lawyers in the audience suggested a looming lawsuit. Patricia Lowe stood to speak, approaching the microphone carefully. Thank you all for coming. Summit Trust takes these allegations seriously. We have reviewed the security footage and interviewed personnel. We acknowledge that the incident involving Miss Wells was handled inappropriately, and we are taking steps to ensure. The massive mahogany door at the back of the room opened. Every head turned instantly. The spontaneous conversation and low murmur of the room died instantly. Simone Wells walked in, She wore a sharp, custom-tailored black suit, her bearing radiating the quiet, earned authority of a woman who built empires and broke barriers. She was followed by her full legal team, all carrying thick portfolios. Patricia Lowe faltered mid-sentence, her eyes wide with shock. She glanced desperately toward the empty chair meant for the chairman, Jonathan Price, realizing the narrative had just been forcefully wrenched from her hands. Simone walked down the center aisle with unhurried confidence. She moved past journalists who were frantically typing and past activists who sensed a significant turning point was about to happen. She reached Jordan and placed one firm, protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. The moment, solidarity and power captured in a single frame, was immortalized by a dozen cameras. Then, without acknowledging Patricia, Simone continued to the stage. Patricia reflexively stepped back from the podium. Simone took her place, adjusted the microphone to her height, and surveyed the room with calm, absolute assurance. "Good afternoon," Simone said, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Simone Wells. I am the CEO of InnovateX Global, and I am also the largest single shareholder of Vanguard Trust Bank, holding 37% of the company's non-institutional common shares." The silence in the room was absolute, profound. This was no longer about a customer service failure. This had become something else entirely, a corporate coup for social justice. Robert Sterling's face, already pale, went completely gray. The woman he had dismissed as just another complaining parent was the hidden owner of a significant portion of his institution, the person with more power over his future than everyone else in the room combined. Simone's eyes found Robert's, held his gaze, and then slowly she addressed the room. The young woman Mr. Sterling tore a check from, the 18-year-old he publicly humiliated and accused of fraud. That was my daughter, Jordan Wells. The check he destroyed was signed by me, from my account for her Stanford tuition. She paused, letting the crushing weight of the revelation settle over the panic-stricken faces of the remaining Vanguard Trust executives. Simone paused, letting the crushing weight of her dual revelation, CEO of InnovateX Global and 37% shareholder of Vanguard Trust, settle over the room. The silence was absolute, heavier than the marble counters of the bank itself. The camera flashes were relentless. Robert Sterling looked like a man watching his life's foundation crumble in real time. "But I'm not here to talk about personal grievances," Simone continued, her voice cutting through the panic she had created. "I'm here because what happened to my daughter is not an isolated incident. It is systemic," the evidence. She nodded toward her legal team. Martha Chappelle and the rest of the lawyers began distributing the thick, physical portfolios to the journalists seated closest to the stage. "Over the past week," Simone announced, her voice rising with controlled indignation, "my team compiled documentation of a clear, demonstrable pattern of discriminatory practices at Vanguard Trust branches across Chicago. We have documented 12 separate incidents over 3 years, 12 customers, all people of color, who were subjected to excessive scrutiny, denied services, or treated with suspicion for transactions that would have been processed without question for white customers." The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed wildly, and corporate control was completely shattered. Patricia Lowe looked like she wanted the stage floor to swallow her whole. The board chairman, Jonathan Price, who was monitoring the live stream remotely, was frantically on the phone. Realizing the extent of Simone's preparation, Simone raised one hand, a gesture of absolute authority that remarkably quieted the room. That was power, not from title or position, but from the absolute certainty of her facts and the legitimacy of her cause. "More damning still," Simone continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "We possess the internal emails demonstrating that this systemic failure was actively protected by regional management. Your manager, Mr. Marcus Webb, repeatedly dismissed these complaints, allowing this culture of bias to persist." Demands for accountability. Simone turned her focus directly onto Robert Sterling, who was visibly shaking. "Mr. Caldwell, you didn't just tear up a check. You tore up my daughter's dignity. You publicly exposed a pattern of discrimination that was allowed to fester because people in authority chose to look away. You treated my family's wealth, earned through decades of hard work and innovation, as inherently illegitimate." Robert's mouth opened, but no sound came out. What defense could he offer? The video was everywhere. The evidence was documented. His dismissive email was now part of a public legal filing. Simone addressed the room again, concluding her statement with the force of an executive order. Effective immediately and as agreed upon by the board of directors this morning, I am calling for fundamental, non-negotiable reform. She listed the demands with chilling clarity. Immediate leadership changes. The board has agreed that Mr. Robert Sterling has been terminated, effective today. Extended accountability. Furthermore, Mr. Marcus Webb has also been terminated for complicity and negligence. Comprehensive reform. Vanguard Trust will institute mandatory, independently audited anti-discrimination and unconscious bias training for every employee, from the tellers to the executive level. A new independent oversight committee will be formed, with significant minority representation, to review all past loan and service denials. Simone paused, delivering her final words to the journalists and the millions watching. This is not about revenge. This is about ensuring that no other young person of color, regardless of their background or achievements, is ever made to feel that their presence, or their legitimate money, is suspicious in spaces built for commerce and community. Vanguard Trust will fix itself, or it will face the financial and legal consequences of its systemic failure. A quiet triumph. The room exploded again, but this time with a different energy, one of shock and victorious confirmation. Security guards immediately moved toward the stage. The board had made its decision before the conference started. This public spectacle was the required announcement. Simone stepped away from the microphone as the security team quietly escorted a shell-shocked Robert Sterling out of the room. She walked down the steps directly to Jordan, pulling her daughter into a fierce, protective embrace while cameras flashed and questions echoed around them. "It's over. Baby," Simone whispered into Jordan's hair. "It's over and we won." Jordan, finally seeing definitive justice delivered, was crying, not from shame or pain, but from profound relief and vindication. The public humiliation had been answered with overwhelming structural power. The press conference room remained chaotic, but the dynamic had shifted completely. While journalists barraged Patricia Lowe and the remaining executives with questions, the cameras remained focused on the departure of Robert Sterling. As Simone finished her declaration of his termination, two discreet professional security personnel moved to Sterling's side. His initial instinct was to resist, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. "This is outrageous. I followed procedure. I'm calling my lawyer," Sterling sputtered, standing up so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. "Mr. Sterling," one of the guards said quietly, placing a firm hand on his back. "Let's go." He tried to appeal to the cameras, his carefully crafted facade completely destroyed.
"This is a lie."
"This is reverse discrimination. She's using her money to attack me. I was protecting the bank." The cameras flashed, capturing the image of the once proud branch manager being physically steered away. His frantic, self-serving protests were drowned out by the shouts of the press and the decisive, cold language of the security team. He was escorted out through a side door, a public symbol of institutional failure and swift corporate justice. The legal hammer, within 48 hours of the press conference. Robert Sterling's life as he knew it was over. Vanguard Trust's official public statement was released immediately after the board meeting, leaving no ambiguity. Mr. Robert Sterling has been terminated for cause, citing violations of company policy, discriminatory practices, and conduct unbecoming of our institutional values. We apologize unreservedly to Ms. Jordan Wells and all customers who experienced similar systemic treatment. The bank's action, however, was only the beginning. Simone's legal team filed a civil rights lawsuit within 24 hours. The suit named not just Sterling, but also Marcus Webb, who was also terminated, and Vanguard Trust itself, documenting a pattern that implicated institutional failure to supervise and correct discriminatory behavior. The lawsuit included the names and documented stories of the other 12 customers who had experienced similar treatment, people who had been too afraid or too discouraged to come forward until Simone's actions gave them cover. Each story was damning. Black business owner questioned extensively about legitimate payroll deposits. Latino family denied a mortgage despite meeting all credit criteria. An Asian American woman asked repeatedly to prove her identity for simple withdrawals from her own account. The pattern was undeniable. Sterling's collapse. Sterling hired a lawyer and attempted to mount a defense, clinging to the idea that he had merely followed procedure. His lawyer advised settlement, apology, and damage control, but Sterling's pride wouldn't let him. He insisted he'd followed the rules and done nothing wrong. The civil court strongly disagreed. After a 3-day preliminary hearing where the security video played repeatedly, where the other customers testified, and where even some former colleagues admitted witnessing concerning behavior, the judge ruled decisively. The financial fallout was swift. A ruling of $7.5 million in compensatory and punitive damages to be paid to the plaintiffs, primarily by Vanguard Trust, but with a significant personal judgment against Sterling. His entire pension was frozen pending further appeal, and his banking license was suspended indefinitely. But the financial penalty was only part of his collapse. News outlets published his name and face alongside the infamous video clip. The story became national shorthand for microaggression and systemic bias. Robert Sterling was no longer a respected branch manager. He was a pariah, the face of discrimination, effectively erased from the banking industry he had spent his life protecting from people like Jordan. The public termination of Robert Sterling and Marcus Webb, coupled with the pending civil lawsuit, forced Vanguard Trust into a period of radical and rapid self-correction. The crisis had evolved from a PR disaster into a mandate for systemic overhaul, dictated entirely by Simone Wells, their largest shareholder and now their de facto ethical compass. Institutional reform. 2 weeks after the press conference, Vanguard Trust held another briefing, this time quiet, somber, and focused entirely on policy change. Chairman Jonathan Price, looking weary but resolute, announced a series of reforms that fully adopted Simone Wells's agenda. Mandatory bias training, a comprehensive, multi-year mandatory anti-discrimination and unconscious bias training program, was immediately rolled out for all employees, from teller to C-suite. The program was designed and administered by an independent national civil rights organization, ensuring accountability. Independent Oversight Committee, an Independent Financial Review Committee, IFRC, was established. It was composed of a majority of external members, including leaders from minority business associations and civil rights groups. This committee was granted full authority to audit all denied loan applications and large transaction scrutinies retroactively for the past 5 years. Hiring and promotion equity. Vanguard Trust pledged a $10 million investment to diversify its hiring pipeline and executive training programs, focusing on retention and promotion within underrepresented communities. The company's stock took a minor hit initially, but many analysts praised the decisive and thorough nature of the cleanup, suggesting the bank had effectively neutralized its long-term reputational risk. The Jordan Wells legacy. To permanently cement the incident as a learning moment, Simone and the Vanguard Trust Board jointly announced the creation of the Jordan Wells Financial Equity Scholarship Fund. Fund details. The fund was endowed with $25 million from Vanguard Trust's operating budget, dedicated to providing full financial aid packages to students from marginalized communities pursuing degrees in finance, economics, or technology at top universities. Symbolism. This action transformed the shredded check into a symbol of investment, reversing the original act of destruction into one of generational creation. The money that Robert Sterling tried to deny one student was now dedicated to empowering thousands. A national symbol and a new beginning. The incident became a national touchstone, studied in business ethics classes and referenced in congressional debates about financial equity. It was a tangible example of the cost of unchecked bias and the power of leveraging capital for social justice. Months later, the Chicago air was warm with the anticipation of late summer. Jordan Wells sat in her newly furnished dorm room on the Stanford University campus. The incident felt like a distant, painful fever dream. She still carried the tattered pieces of the check in a small sealed envelope tucked into her desk drawer, not as a reminder of her humiliation, but as a silent memorial to the fight she had won. She was no longer just the victim in the viral video. She was the architect of systemic change. Jordan picked up her phone to text her mother. She was ready for her first class, corporate finance. She knew she wasn't just there to learn how the system worked. She was there to learn how to own it and how to continue fixing it. The system had tried to exclude her, but thanks to her mother's power and her own quiet strength, Jordan Wells had not only entered the space, she had fundamentally changed the rules of entry for everyone who would follow.